Perfect. So yeah, hi everyone, I'm Janis, and I want to understand how the brain takes in this myriad of sensory stimuli and marvelously constructs from it the reality that we consciously experience. Shall we begin? All right. So before anything else, I want you to look at this picture first, because it keeps appearing in my research. What's special about this picture is that the image is always the same, but your conscious percept of it switches rather dramatically. Yeah, you can either see it as a face looking to the right, or you can see it as a face that's looking at you and is occluded partially. So the physical input is the same, but the conscious percept of the face view changes. But that is not all that is changing, actually, if you think about it. For example, if you perceive the face looking to the right, then this white region here will be perceived as background behind the face, right? But when you perceive the face that's looking at you, if you can make that switch, you will see the white region as an occluder in the foreground of the face, like this. Now, this highlights the coherence or self-consistency of conscious perception. Importantly, you never perceive the face looking at you while also perceiving the white region as background. But figure ground and object view are always consistent. So not only the object identity or view changes, which is represented in more high-level areas of your brain, like IT cortex, but the percept of figure ground segmentation changes with it, which is presumably represented in lower-level segmentation regions. So it's hugely interesting to me how the brain coordinates such switches and what happens when your brain switches its conscious percept from one interpretation of the world to another. Is it that high-level regions that encode object identity switch first and then feed this new hypothesis back to segmentation areas? Or do segmentation areas first switch the figure ground interpretation and then feed this forward to object areas? Or is it the brain as a whole working together as a recurrent network that together converges to an interpretation of the world that is consistent across layers of representation? Spoiler alert. So I have not fully solved this question yet, but I'm now closer than ever to answering it, and I will show you preliminary data results to the question near the end. So the overarching goal of my research is to understand how the brain generates a self-consistent conscious percept by studying the interactions between different nodes of the cortical hierarchy. For example, we know that face view and identity is represented in face patches in the object recognition area IT cortex. And our lab has studied these face patches for the past decades, and they're actually quite remarkable. So if you stick an electrode into one of these face patches and just listen to the neurons, you will hear that almost all the neurons respond very strongly to faces and very weakly to most other objects. And through the work of my lab members, we understand the code for faces so well now that we can actually reconstruct the face that the monkey saw from neural activity alone. Yeah. So on the left here, you can see some face images that we showed to the monkey. And then we used just the neural activity to basically from scratch reconstruct those faces. And the reconstructions are shown on the right. And you can see that the reconstructions quite accurately resemble the actual faces we presented. So Doris and me recently wrote a comprehensive review about the face patches that you can read if you're interested. So that will tell you everything you need to know about face patches. On the other hand, figure ground is thought to be represented in retinotopic cortex. We have done some work in those regions also to find neural correlates of segmentation. By recording from neurons in both regions at the same time, we were hoping to elucidate the mechanisms of how brain regions interact to generate a conscious percept and then propagate it across the brain. The focus of the paper I present today is on the face patches and whether they actually represent conscious perception. So our previous experience with the face patches made us wonder if face patches actually represent whether the monkey is aware that the stimulus is a face, or is it just processing visual input in a feed-forward way? Indeed, for all the findings of our lab so far, face cells could be simply described as feed-forward filters of visual input. For example, view invariance increases as one goes anterior. Yeah? What that means is that in the posterior and middle face patches, the cells are tuned to view. So they fire differently depending on whether the face is looking at you or whether the face is looking to the side. But then the more anterior face patch, like AM, generalizes across views. Yeah, so the cells don't care anymore which way the face is looking, and instead they encode the more abstract concept of identity. But this can be explained by simple feed-forward pooling mechanisms. On the other hand, there's this predictive coding or Bayesian inference framework, according to which feedback is important. Yeah. For example, one model of bistable phenomena, like the face illusion we just saw, is that cortex is always performing inference of what object is there. And it has a prior that two different objects cannot occupy the same location in 3D space. So we wanted to know, are face patches just feed-forward filters of visual input, or do they actually encode whether the monkey sees a face or not? And by see, I mean whether he has a conscious percept of a face or not. Yeah? So do face patches represent consciousness? And what I just described are the sub-questions of our main questions, to which I will also get more near the end of this talk. And that is, what is the brain's mechanisms for generating conscious perception? So for me, having conscious experience is the most important reason why it matters to us, whether we are dead or alive. And while consciousness is the most familiar thing, at the same time, it's also one of the most mysterious and hard to pin down. All right. So let's define consciousness first, right? The definition of consciousness is a bit different from other definitions, since you cannot just point at something in the outside world and say, oh, this is consciousness, or explained by other things in the world. But instead, you have to, well, look within yourself. So I define it as subjective private experience. For example, what it feels like to see the color red or taste a red wine. You also have to distinguish between general consciousness and specific consciousness. Yeah. General consciousness is a state, whether you're conscious and awake or not, for example, when you're anesthetized or in dreamless sleep. And specific consciousness, on the other hand, is more about the specific contents of consciousness, such as experiencing the color red. In this presentation, I'm going with the specific consciousness definition. All right, so we want to find the neural correlates of consciousness, right? This is tricky because you have to extract the conscious percept from a sticky soup of confounding factors, as you will see. Now, there are a bunch of theories of consciousness, and I think they cannot all be true at the same time. But the experiments that we are doing will hopefully arbitrate between them and hopefully falsify a number of them so we can thin out the playing field. So I wanted to give you guys a quick background of the 4 major competing theories of consciousness that we try to distinguish between with our experiments, just in case there are people in the audience that may not know about them. And if you already know all of them, just go take a nap, okay? So to give you some background, the field is currently divided into at least 4 major camps or ideas. There are more theories, but I'm just going to focus on these for now. First, higher order theory states that one is only conscious of a state if there's a higher order state representing oneself in that state. Now, what does that mean? Well, for example, if you look at an apple, your brain will process it, right? And there will be a visual state representing the apple somewhere in your brain. But according to the theory, you will only be conscious of that apple if there's also a higher order state somewhere else in your brain that represents you seeing that apple. Second, global workspace theory posits that there's a neuronal workspace somewhere in the brain, something like the RAM in your computer, that has broad connectivity and can be accessed by a number of systems, such as in memory, attention, and evaluation. So according to this theory, you only become conscious of a stimulus if it reaches this workspace and becomes accessible by all these systems in your brain. Third, according to integrated information theory, consciousness can be measured by a single number called phi, or integrated information. Now, in this theory, a system has high levels of consciousness if the information of the whole system is larger than the sum of its parts. And finally, according to recurrent processing theory, when visual input reaches your brain, there's an initial, automatic, and unconscious feed-forward wave that processes the stimulus. But this initial feed-forward wave does not cause a conscious percept. Instead, you only become conscious of it if there's a feedback wave that goes from higher level regions in your brain to lower level sensory regions. And so it is this recurrent processing that evokes conscious perception. And that theory goes well with another framework that has been very important, not necessarily for consciousness in particular, but for neuroscience in general, which is predictive coding. So predictive coding is a theory of coding and learning in the brain that postulates that the purpose or goal of the brain is to predict the incoming sensory input. And I think this can also be a useful framework for understanding consciousness. For example, there may be a brain region somewhere that has a high-level model of the world, and it updates this model based on incoming input. And this world model then tries to regenerate sensory input in lower-level regions and kind of reconstruct the incoming image like a graphics engine. So perhaps what we consciously perceive is not just the brain processing the input and extracting features, but rather the high-level world model recreating this input in sensory regions. This would also explain the vividness and detail that we assert to our experience everywhere in our conscious field, even the periphery. So physically in our periphery, you can barely perceive color. And we can put you in a VR headset and make your periphery completely grayscale, but you won't notice the difference. So even though the color information is physically lacking, you still perceive it as very colorful. And I think that hints at the generative model of the brain that just fills in the color with what it predicts that color should be. Now, there's a face-off in neuroscience about whether consciousness is in the front or the back of the brain. You should know that visual information reaches your cortex at the back. So this is the back of your brain. And then the signal moves more interior and it's being processed more and more abstract features are being computed. So proponents of higher order theory and global workspace theory believe that higher order states, or the neuronal workspace, are represented in prefrontal cortex. So they think that consciousness is in the front of the brain. On the other hand, proponents of integrated information theory have suggested that there's a posterior hot zone of consciousness in the back of the brain, where integrated information is high. Also, in recurrent processing theory, it is a feedback to sensory regions in the back of the brain that is critical for consciousness. So this is an ongoing debate, and so far there's no conclusive evidence for either of these theories. But our monkey experiments, which I will describe next, hope to rigorously determine whether a region in the brain actually represents conscious perception, and then also later find out where this conscious perception is first generated. Okay, so first, how do you rigorously determine whether a brain region represents conscious perception? Now, in a typical task with a monkey, there are at least 3 variables to be represented. First, a monkey views an image, which causes visual processing of the physical input, regardless of whether the monkey eventually becomes conscious of it or not. Then, the image may evoke the conscious percept of, for example, a face. And then, the monkey may report that he saw a face. Now, if a neuron fires specifically during this task, how do we know it represents conscious perception rather than the other 2 factors? So we saw the bistable face earlier, right? Another special case of bistable phenomena is binocular rivalry. In binocular rivalry, you present, for example, a face to the left eye and an incompatible stimulus, for example, a taco, to the right eye. And when you do that, what happens is you perceive not a superimposition of the 2, but instead your conscious percept will stochastically alternate between seeing a face and seeing a taco. So you may first perceive a face, and then suddenly you see a taco, and then a face again, and back and forth in an endless dance, just like for the bistable face we saw earlier. So the conscious percept is changing, while the physical input is fixed, which allows dissociating between conscious perception and physical input. In the 90s, Scheinberg and Logothetis trained monkeys to report their conscious percept by pulling a lever, and found that 90% of cells in IT were modulated by what the monkey reported. But does it imply that those cells encode conscious perception? No, because they may be modulated by the act of reporting rather than the conscious percept itself. So if you report whether you see a face or taco, for example, by pressing a button, then all kinds of cognitive factors come into play. For example, you have to introspect and make a decision what you see, and then you have to do the actual motor action to report it. So modulations in the brain could be because of these cognitive processes instead of the conscious perception. So indeed, Fresh and al. Recently found that many fMRI modulations by conscious percept disappear if human subjects do not report their perceptual switches. So we wanted to study with electrophysiology whether cells actually encode conscious perception without report. But how could we possibly know what a monkey is perceiving if we don't ask him to report it? So Fresh and others use optokinetic nystagmus and pupil size to infer the percept. And so here we introduce a new no report paradigm that infers this percept from fixational eye movements. Yeah. So here's the idea we came up with. So we train monkeys to follow a jumping fixation spot. Yeah, can you see the red spot that is jumping around? We train the monkeys to follow it with their eyes. And they learn that very quickly, within like 2 days, just like a cat likes to follow a laser pointer. However, what the monkey does not know is that the fixation spot is in a different position in the left and right eye. Yeah. So hence, when the monkey is perceiving the taco, he will saccade to the fixation spot in the left eye. And when he's perceiving the face, he will saccade to the fixation spot in the right eye. Does that make sense? So we can infer his percept from his eye movements, right? If he's looking at the fixation spot in the left eye, we just infer he's seeing the taco. If he's looking at the fixation spot in the right eye, we infer he's seeing a face. And we tested that this actually works in humans, because in humans, we can very easily instruct them to follow the spot and at the same time report their percept by pressing a button. And then we can try to predict their report from their eye movements. On the left here, you can see his eye movements when the subject reported that its percept switched from face to object. And the red trace is the distance from the fixation spot in the eye of the face, and the blue trace is the distance from the object's fixation spot. You can see that when the subject reports a switch to object, the distance from the object fixation spot becomes smaller. Yeah, that means the subject is following the fixation spot in the left eye. On the other hand, when the subject is reporting a switch to face, its eyes follow the face's fixation spot. So we can predict what the subject is reporting on a given trial from its eye movements. And across subjects, we can predict it with an accuracy of 93% on average. So this is cool, because that means that we actually don't need the subjects to report their percept anymore, but we can just read it out from their eye movements. And assuming this works in monkeys, we never have to train them to report. So we can distill consciousness. So we then use the same paradigm in monkeys while recording from their face patches. And monkeys behaviorally also showed switches in eye movement patterns, where they first followed one fixation spot and then switched and started following another fixation spot. So based on this, we inferred that at this time the percepts changed. So here's an example cell, face cell, recorded from face patch ML, which is shown here. And first, we presented a condition where we physically switched the stimulus between unambiguous objects and unambiguous faces. Yeah, so there's no binocular rivalry here yet. Yeah, and the stimuli were just shown monocularly. So you can see from this plot that the cell responded more after a switch to face, shown in red, than after a switch to object, shown in blue. And this is expected because it's a face cell, and we already know that they are driven by physically presented faces. Now, the big question is, what happens during binocular rivalry? When physical input is the same, but we infer from the eye movement that the conscious percept switched to face or to object. Any bets? Here's the answer. The face cell responded clearly more to a perceptual switch to face than to a perceptual switch to object. And this was the case even though the physical input was fixed and there was no report. Yeah? So this suggests that this face cell actually encoded the conscious percept during rivalry. Now here's another example cell from the more anterior face patch AM, which receives input from ML and encodes face identity instead of face view. So this face cell also encoded the conscious percept of a face. So you can see here, there's a very clear difference in response. So these were 2 example cells. Now here's a summary of all cells. Every dot here is a cell that has 2 modulation indices. The physical modulation index on the x-axis shows you how strongly the cell preferred faces compared to objects. Yeah, so it's close to 1 if it responded strongly to an unambiguous face and didn't respond to the unambiguous object. Most cells are on the right here because we recorded from face cells, face patches. And the perceptual information modulation index on the y-axis here shows you how much the cell preferred the perceived face over the perceived object in the binocular rivalry condition, where physical input was fixed. And importantly, there's very strong correlations between those 2 modulation indices. And this shows that cells that were strongly face selective for physically presented faces also preferred perceived faces in the rivalry condition. Yeah? So most cells in IT face patches do encode conscious perception. And the proportion of cells that significantly were modulated by conscious percept increased, going from the lower level face patch ML to the higher level face patch AM. So you can see the conscious percept became more explicit, and there were also less inconsistently tuned cells as we go up the hierarchy. So that's great, but there's one more important confound that we had to control for. So to show the binocular rivalry stimuli, we put these red cyan goggles on the monkey. So because of that, the face was always red and in the right eye, while the object was always cyan and in the left eye. So playing the devil's advocate, you could argue that the cells were not actually modulated by conscious perception, but all they really care about is whether the fixation spot that the monkey was looking at was red or cyan, and whether it's in the left eye or the right eye. So to control for this, we just switched around the colors. The left plot shown here is the original color condition, so it's pretty much the same plot I just showed you, but the modulation index is now not face minus object, but whether it's preferred identity minus non-preferred stimulus identity. And the preferred identity was determined by whether the cell responded more strongly to the face or the object in the physical condition. Yeah? So by definition, in this plot, all the dots are on the right. Now for the switch colors, we assigned the preferred identity based on the original colors. Yeah? So if a cell responded more strongly to the physical face in the original color condition, the preferred identity here is still a face. And you can see that most cells are in the top right corner. That means they preferred a face. If they preferred a face for the original color, they consistently preferred a face for the switch colors. And that is true for both the physical and the rivalry condition. So that shows that cells follow the perceived identity of the stimulus rather than the color or eye of origin of the fixation spot that's in the fovea. So this confirms that face cells in IT do indeed encode conscious perception and not just some confounding factor. In this study, we recorded not only with single electrode, but also multi-electrode arrays. And in rodent neuroscience, one technique that has revolutionized electrophysiology is neuropixels, which are probes that have many more electrodes than previous probes. Since they were designed for rodents, they are too short for recording for monkey IT. So we got involved in the development of long neuropixels specifically designed for monkeys. And we were lucky to be the first lab to insert a prototype of these primate neuropixels in a monkey. So this is the first recording we did in face patch ML. And these prototypes have 128 electrodes. All the cells shown here as rows were recorded simultaneously. And these are the responses to 96 different images. So we recorded 80 cells simultaneously, and most of them were face cells. Yeah? So you can see the strong response to the different face images, but very weak responses to the different other object images. And here's a recording from just 2 weeks ago with the new version of active NeuroPixels, which has 384 channels. This gives us like these incredible yields of hundreds of neurons, and more than 100 of these cells were face cells. So we can record this beautiful data with these probes with hundreds of neurons that are all encoding the same category of object, a face. And you can just look at these time courses of these simultaneously recorded face cells and see the switching happening in real time. So here's a stimulus physically switched from an unambiguous face to an unambiguous object and back. And you can see that the face cells all go from active to silent to active again. And then I showed binocular rivalry stimuli in that first ever neuropixels recording that we did in the monkey. And this is an example time course doing binocular rivalry, where we inferred the percept from eye movements. Yeah. So the eye movements are shown here. And just looking at the neural data, you can definitely tell that cells are more active during the perceived face epochs, yeah, shown in red, compared to the perceived object epochs, shown in blue. And we can now actually decode from the neural data alone what the monkey was consciously perceiving, even though the stimulus was always the same. Yeah. So we trained a linear decoder to decode what the monkey consciously perceived on a single trial basis. And each of the sessions we recorded is one plus symbol here. And you can see that the decoding accuracy for physical was sometimes almost perfect. For binocular rivalry, it was a bit harder to decode the percept, but we still got decoding accuracies of up to 88% on the best session. And as ground truth, we used the percept inferred by eye movements, which is also not perfect. But overall, this is very useful because with these ultra high yield electrodes, we can decode what the monkey is consciously perceiving at any given time from the neural data alone. And we do not even need the no report paradigm anymore, right? We can just look at the neural time course. Now, in the field of consciousness research, there has developed this notion that most IT cells exactly reflect conscious perception. But if you look at this plot, it seems that modulation during binocular rivalry was weaker than for unambiguous switches, yeah? As most dots are under the diagonal. And actually, if you read the original paper by Scheinberg and Logothetis carefully, you will actually see that in their data, the modulation during rivalry was also weaker. But since Logothetis recorded with single electrodes, and so they had to average responses across trials, it is possible that this weaker modulation is because on some trials, the monkey misreported his conscious percept. Yeah. So in this schematic, let's say the responses on single trials look like this during the physical condition, right? So on all trials, there's a very strong response to the face and a weak response of the neuron to object. And it could be that the modulation is just as strong during binocular rivalry, but the monkey just made a mistake sometimes, right? So sometimes the trials here are mislabeled. And this would also lead to ostensibly weaker modulation. So therefore, we looked at responses on single trials to see whether there's actually weaker modulation or whether it's just because of mislabeling. Yeah. Scheinberg and Logothetis, they recorded with single electrodes, so they could not do that because of the high intertrial variability of single neurons. But we took advantage of the simultaneous recording of many face cells in ML. And we averaged activity across neurons instead of trials. And that way we can get away of the intertrial noise, yeah, and get not too noisy responses for single trials. And these histograms show average activity on individual trials. Yeah? So this is a histogram of across trials. Yeah? And you can see that for the physical condition, the trial responses are quite separated for object and face. Yeah? So we see a peak, like many trials, for object, and another peak for face. Yeah? So on most trials, for the face, it responded very differently and much stronger than for object trials. So even if we don't label the trials, yeah, so here in gray, all the trials labels are thrown away, you can still see that the distribution is clearly bimodal with two distinct peaks. On the other hand, for binocular rivalry, the distribution was much narrower, yeah, so the modulation was weaker, and the distributions are less separate. And this is not an artifact of this mislabeling of trials, because even when you remove the labels, you can see that the distribution is less bimodal. So this shows that modulation is veridically weaker during binocular rivalry, and this is not just an artifact of mislabeling of trials. Now, one tantalizing possible explanation for this phenomenon could be that cells multiplex the conscious percept with the veridical physical stimulus. Now, what does it mean? Let me make clear what I mean by that idea of multiplexing. If a face cell's response is strong during a physically presented stimulus A, and weak during physical stimulus B. Until now, people believe that the response during binocular rivalry is winner take all. Yeah? So the response during consciously perceived A is just like the physical stimulus A for most cells in IT. However, since the modulation was weaker during rivalry, one possible explanation is that cells have a code for both the consciously perceived and the suppressed stimulus at all times. Yeah? And the response is just biased towards the stimulus that is perceived. So that could explain this weaker modulation. But to test this multiplexing hypothesis more, we need to be able to vary the suppressed stimulus while keeping the conscious percept fixed. So here we presented two different binocular rivalry stimuli. On the left, the binocular rivalry stimulus is made of face and taco, and on the right, the stimulus is made of face and apple. So now we can look at trials where the conscious percept was face and the suppressed stimulus was either taco or apple. And so to see if we can decode the suppressed stimulus, we again trained a linear classifier. But now it had to distinguish between trials where the conscious percept was fixed as A and the suppressed stimulus was either B or C. So the decoder couldn't use any information about conscious content to discriminate between these two types of trials. So the conscious percept was the same. Yeah? Instead, to do the decoding, it could only use unconscious information. But surprisingly, the decoder could still do it. It could decode the suppressed stimulus significantly above chance with 74% accuracy. So this shows that phase cells encode not only the conscious percept, but they must also encode the suppressed unconscious stimulus. Now, it could be that there are two different subpopulations of cells in IT, with one population of cells encoding the conscious percept and another population encoding the suppressed stimulus. To test this, we compared the dominant modulation index, that is how strongly the cell is tuned to the dominant consciously perceived stimulus, with the suppressed modulation index. And we found a significant positive correlation across cells. This means that there are not two different subpopulations, but the same cells that encode conscious percept also encode the suppressed stimulus. Okay, let's summarize. It's a commonly held belief in the field that most cells in IT cortex respond to the conscious percept during binocular rivalry exactly as they do to the physically presented stimulus. So if you physically present three stimuli that have three different population responses, A, B, and C, then the response during binocular rivalry, according to this view, should be the same as the physical response to the consciously perceived stimulus. But the fact that we could decode both the conscious and the suppressed stimulus shows that this is not true. Instead, single cells multiplex both the conscious percept and the veridical physical stimulus. And either can be read out from the population using two different decoders. So we have one decoder for the conscious percept and one for the suppressed stimulus. Now, there's two different models of how this multiplexing could be implemented. One possibility is that a cell's average firing rate is determined by mixed selectivity to conscious percept and suppressed stimulus. In this model, the firing rate is just a weighted sum of conscious percept and suppressed stimulus, and spikes are generated randomly from this firing rate through a Poisson process. In an alternative model, one type of spikes may represent conscious percept, and another type of spikes may represent the veridical physical stimulus. And the type of spike may define in different ways. For example, there could be a fast oscillation of neural activity, and spikes on one phase of this oscillation encode the conscious percept, where spikes during another phase of this oscillation encode the physical stimulus. And this oscillation would, of course, have to be faster than the frequency of perceptual switches. So if true, this would be remarkable because it would mean that our conscious experience, which ostensibly appears to be continuous, is actually stitched together from different periods of time. Alternatively, it could also be that spikes that occur synchronously with other neurons encode the conscious percept, and asynchronous spikes encode the physical stimulus. And future experiments may be able to distinguish between these two different submodels. Okay, so this is everything that's in that paper so far. If you have time, I could give you a little sneak preview about experiments that we're doing right now. But I have to warn you that those are it's more like preliminary data. But if you guys are interested, we could go into that. Do you have time for that?
Yeah, I think absolutely we have time.
Great. Okay, cool. So all the cells I showed you just now were from macaque, from monkey face pictures. But we have now also performed electrophysiological recordings in humans in collaboration with Barun Vadia and Uli Ruteshauser at Cedars-Sinai. And the advantage of humans is that we can just tell them to either report the percept while doing the fixation task, or to not think about the percept and just do the fixation task. So we can directly compare activations with and without a report. And we recorded single unit data from human epilepsy patients across a large number of brain areas while they were doing the different paradigms. And the data is still preliminary, but I will show you there's 2 example cells here that were recorded from a brain region called pre-SMA, or pre-supplementary motor area. Yeah. And you can see that that this cell, for example, was selective to tackle. And that was true for physical switches as well as doing binocular rivalry, whether there was active report or no active report. And here's a cell that's slightly selective to the face. But again, this is quite preliminary. So, okay, so what implications does everything I just showed you have for consciousness? Sorry. Strictly speaking, what we have shown so far at most is that face cells in IT are modulated by conscious percept during rivalry. But does it mean they represent the conscious percept of a face in general? Well, it depends on what the mechanisms of rivalry is. And the debate about the mechanism of binocular rivalry actually goes back over a century. Yeah? So Hermann Helmholtz, William James, and Sir Charles Sherrington believed that competition in binocular rivalry occurred at a high level between different stimulus percepts, such as the tree and butterfly. But then William Leveled came along and proposed that what rivals during rivalry are just the 2 eyes at a low level between monocular populations in V1. Now, if binocular rivalry is indeed fully resolved in V1, it's difficult to say from our results that face patches represent consciousness per se, because the competition in V1 would be more like akin to a simple mechanistic shutting of either eye, except that it's intracortical. And face patch may just reflect this low-level shutting between the eyes. What's a bit at odds with that hypothesis, however, is that in V1, actually only 18% of cells are modulated by conscious percept at all. And they're modulated quite weakly. Also, studies found no difference between binocular and monocular neurons. Also, when you show these mosaics of 2 stimuli in the left eye and right eye, then the percept can flip between the 2 stimuli, like a monkey and this text, rather than between the 2 eyes. So what seems to rival in this case are the higher level stimulus representations rather than the 2 eyes. So yeah, alternatively, switches in binocular rivalry may be generated by a general mechanism of conscious percept generation. For example, at a higher level brain region that tries to just find an interpretation of the world that makes the most sense. So far, virtually all studies on binocular rivalry have only revealed correlates of conscious perception, of conscious perception. For example, which brain regions do or do not encode conscious percept. But we are now trying to dissect the mechanisms of binocular rivalry and hopefully of conscious perception in general. So to study the mechanisms of conscious percept generation, we're going to go back to the very beginning of this talk. So we will record from 2 different nodes of the cortical hierarchy, while the monkey is viewing bistable stimuli, in this case, binocular rivalry. So we were planning initially, if you remember, to record from face patches and segmentation areas at the same time. But for now, we thought it's easier to just record from 2 face patches at the same time, because this face patch network in itself constitutes a functional hierarchy. Yeah, so we know that all these face patches are anatomically connected to each other. And we know that ML is tuned to views and gives input to AM. And AM then pulls across views and encodes a more abstract feature, face identity, and gives feedback to ML. So by recording from both of them at the same time, we can see how nodes of the hierarchy interact during conscious percept generation. For example, if the mechanism is bottom up, right? So if the perceptual switches happen somewhere in the back of your brain like we want, and then being fed forward, then we would expect to see activity in ML first, and then followed by AM. On the other hand, if the mechanism is more like a top-down chain, then we should see that the conscious percept becomes explicit first in AM and then in ML. Yeah, does that make sense? So here we recorded from ML and AM at the same time. And I have to warn you that this is super preliminary data from this one session. So take it with a huge grain of salt, okay? But yes, you can see ML cells on top here, and that were recorded with neuropixels, and AM cells on the bottom. So right now it was hard for us to reach AM with the neuropixels, so this is just done with the S probe. So we see less cells, but we're working on doing neuropixels on both phase patches at the same time right now. But still, you can clearly see switches in neural activity, right? So the left plot here is an example time course with physical switches, and the right one is an example with binocular rivalry. And then what we do is we detect switches based on neural activity in ML alone. Yeah, so we just look at where do the neurons go from silent to starting to fire all of a sudden. Yeah, and you can see the red lines here is the times that we detected, where we infer that there's a putative switch to phase from the neural activity. And then we look at what happens for the AM cells around the switch time. Yeah, and for this switch time, for example, here you can see that AM cells also go from silent to active. And if you look closely, maybe you can see that the AM cells start firing a few milliseconds later, maybe. And that would make sense because it's a physical input is just bottom up. So ML gives input to AM, so AM should be a bit later. Now on the right side, here we can see a perceptual switch where the physical input was the same, but does your conscious percept putatively switched from object to phase. And this time, interestingly, if you look at AM, it seems that it starts firing slightly earlier. Yeah, you can see that's already building up activity here, maybe. So it's hard to tell from the single anecdotal switches. So what we did is we detected all the switches across this whole experiment based on the activity in ML, and then averaged across these different times, and averaged the activity in both ML and AM across this time, and looked at what happens in AM. And that's what's shown here. Yeah. So if you average across all switches in the whole experiment and across cells, then you get this response in black for ML, and the red response shows the response in AM. So left again is physical condition. And yeah, you can see that AM seems to start firing slightly later than ML as measured by the half peak time. And that makes sense again, because AM gets input from ML. But now looking at binocular rivalry, now it appears as if AM fires before ML. Again, this is very preliminary, and I still have to replicate this experiment, so I have little confidence about whether this is true or not. But if it turns out to be true, that's very exciting, because it would suggest a feedback mechanism of switches in conscious percept. So it would be consistent, for example, with that predictive coding model, where there's a high-level world model that gives feedback to sensory regions to recreate the sensory input. And we could then use the same method to find the origin of conscious percept generation, right? Because phase patches are not just in inferotemporal cortex, but they also phase patch spin-offs in prefrontal cortex, parietal cortex, hippocampus, amygdala, and more. So we're covering a lot of brain regions. And we can then compare relative latencies for all these regions. Yeah? If we just stick neuropixels in all of these regions, then we can find out where a conscious percept first becomes explicit in the brain. And that way, we can hopefully get to the source of conscious percept generation. Yeah? So find out where a conscious percept first becomes explicit. And what we also want to do then is to do like causal experiments to disambiguate between the different theories of consciousness. So to summarize, the program of this research we're doing now is to track the footprints of conscious experience in the brain until we get to the source, like the place or signature by which a conscious percept first gets ignited in the brain. And that will allow us to arbitrate between the different theories. If it's in prefrontal cortex, that would leave higher order theory and global workspace theory. But if it's in posterior cortex, that would falsify those two and give support to, say, IIT or recurrent processing theory. So let me summarize these future directions. I think we are in a unique positions because we have access to these phase patches. And maybe the phase patches can be used as a key to unlock the mystery of conscious percept generation, because all the cells in them have this very beautiful and strong signal to the same category of object, a face. And we understand it so well that we can reconstruct a face that the monkey saw. And what's critical about the phase patch system is that it's hierarchical. So we can record from two directly connected nodes of the cortical hierarchy. And finally, we have these new ultra-high yield recording technologies like the Neuropixels, with which we can record hundreds of face cells at the same time. And we also want to do causal manipulations to determine the causal role of each node in the hierarchy for generating and propagating conscious percepts. Okay, so I want to acknowledge my PI, Doris Zhao, who has been like an incredible advisor, and also the whole lab for being an endless source of inspiration, critical feedback, and practical assistance, and without whom none of this would have been possible. I also want to shout out Varun Vadia and Uli Ruteshauser, who are making the human experiments possible, and also Frank and Franchi for helping me with the Neuropixels insertions. Thank you very much.